Well, hello, I am Roy Harriman with Strategos International here with Vaughn Baker, President of Strategos, and we thank you for joining us on Facebook Live. And we, as always, welcome comments, questions, and if you benefit from the information shared here today, we would love it if you shared it with others. So our topic today is our physiological and psychological reactions during a crisis. And Vaughn, this is very important because the FBI just released a report stating that there were 943 people either killed or wounded as a result of active shooter attacks in 2016 and 2017. So we want to be aware, we want to be alert, and we want to know what we don't know, and that is this topic here that we're dealing with. And so to get us started, we're talking about our psychological and physiological reactions during a crisis. And let's shape those words into layman's terms. Would it be correct to say that essentially we're going to talk about how we think, feel, and instinctually react during a crisis?
Yeah, that would be accurate. And of course, instinctually reaction would be before training, and then a trained response would be post-training. So we want to be sure to add that on there as well.
Right. So instinctive is the untrained kind of raw response, and we want to teach people to then respond instead of reacting. Well, Vaughn, let's start with instinct. You know, we're likely unaware of most of our instinctual behavior. So when we speak of behaving by instinct, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, it's those things that come natural to us based on our life experiences, based on our environment we grew up in, and just overall experiences. However, there are some general instincts that are very common to most people. And many times, your instincts are not the highest level of human performance, and most of the time, in fact, that's not the case. So even though when you hear the word instinct, so I was just reacting based on my instincts, many times that's an incorrect response. So the whole purpose of why we train is not to reinforce our instincts, but to overcome them. A couple examples of this would be if somebody was, if you've not had training, say a boxer before he's had training, before he's learned how to box, or even a person that's a victim of somebody throwing a punch at him, it's very instinctual to flinch when that punch is thrown, or to fall back before the punch even connects. It's very instinctual to be afraid of the dark. But once we train, we can overcome that instinct to flinch. And as far as the dark is concerned, once we train, as far as in low light conditions, we can actually leverage darkness to our advantage. So that's just couple examples of what we're talking about as far as instincts versus a trained response.
Now, when it comes to an active shooter threat, how do our instincts come into play, for better or for worse?
Well, there's a couple instinctual responses that are very natural, that are not good, but they're very natural for people. And when I bring these examples up, I don't want anybody to think that we're judging people based on stating that it's the wrong reaction or the wrong instinctual reaction. But it is very natural. A couple of those things that come to mind is when we hear things like firecrackers or balloons popping, or even what we think is gunshot, it's very instinctual to go see what is happening. Now, as far as going to see what is happening, that's a natural, because about 80% of the information that you and I gather to make a decision comes from sight. However, we need to learn to trust the information that we gather from our other four senses. And in this case, the example I give would be based on what we hear. We need to make a good decision based on that. If we go investigate what that noise was, that could put us in a really bad situation. Another instinctual response that many people have in an active shooter event is a phenomenon we call normalcy bias. You and I are biased to the normal that happens each and every day. So when the abnormal occurs, we have difficulty accepting that, and we even minimize or rationalize the reality of what is happening in a way to try to make it normal again. So we want to overcome that instinct of normalcy bias. And then the third example I will give you is a recent example, but we see it frequently in people that eventually become victims of an attacker, is this instinct to get to the fetal position or to get underneath something or to hide underneath a desk or a cubicle. instinctually, that's very natural to do. Why? Because if you've ever seen a fight between two people, the person that's getting beat up is naturally goes to the fetal position. If you look at video from the Fort Lauderdale shooting, from Las Vegas massacre, you will see people that instinctually responded and immediately dropped to the fetal position. One of the worst things you can do is get to the fetal position and become immobile, especially in a wide open area, which both Fort Lauderdale and Las Vegas, that's exactly what happened. And if you're from the attacker's point of view, it's much easier to hit a stationary target that is in the fetal position and not even able to respond to where the threat's coming from. So all three of those are examples of how maybe our instincts are not the highest level of human performance when it comes to responding to an active shooter event.
So essentially, doing what comes naturally is not necessarily the best response for us. Our instincts aren't necessarily a good guide for what to do when we're in a crisis.
Well, doing what comes naturally can be a very good thing, but it's what I would say is those things that come naturally post-training. Once we've trained and we've committed to training, whether it's a boxer or a martial artist, and now what comes very natural after they've trained, and it's not instinctual, it's a subconscious decision, which is many times just as fast as an instinctual reaction. Those are very good responses, but when we talk about instincts minus the benefit of training, that's where you can really get yourself in trouble.
Thank you. Excellent point. And by the way, we welcome your comments, your questions. If this information is of value, we welcome you sharing with others. Tyson, thank you for watching. And Tyson is saying that Vaughn is an articulate communicator of active shooter training principles. So we certainly appreciate that. We're glad it's a benefit. So thank you. Thank you. So Vaughn, let me address the question for someone who may think, well, if these are my natural reactions, if I was born to have these reactions, how can I just shut those off? What am I supposed to be, become a stoic or something like that? How can we really control things that are hardwired in us?
Sure. Well, no, those things that do come natural based on our experiences and based on how we're wired physiologically and psychologically. We want to just become aware of them. And once we become aware of them, we can train past that point to overcome those natural instincts. So we're not shutting off our humanity. We're just enhancing our humanity and enhancing those senses that we already have based on proper response through training and through life experience and in dealing with these attackers that attack people in public places.
No, that makes sense. And a related quote that it's not original with me, I don't believe it's original with Strategos either, is that we hope that in a crisis people will rise to the occasion, but it's more realistic to expect them to rise to the level of their training. So how can training get us from a raw, unproductive, instinctual response to a positive, productive response? Kind of the difference between a reaction and a response. Like no one wants a reaction to medication, they want to respond to a cure.
Sure, absolutely. And what will happen is instead of instinctually responding or reacting, we're gonna recall what we've been trained to do and respond properly. Now, how does this work? This is a process that we, of course, call training, and then the question becomes, what is training? Well, there's several types of training, and the good news is, just by the fact of, for example, normalcy bias, we can overcome that just by you and I talking about it and becoming aware that it's a real phenomenon that gets people killed in almost every active shooter event. And not only active shooter events, but also even other types of crisis. Normalcy bias, if you look at videotapes from the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, you will see people standing on the beach staring at the tsunami coming in and never moving because they couldn't accept the crisis. But this process of training we're talking about for active threat training that we do, even as short of time frame as 4 hours, we take people through a lecture, a 2-hour lecture, and then we take them through a walkthrough with demonstrations and questions and answers by the instructor. And then one of the most important aspects of training is we really believe that you have to create a reasonable simulation of the real thing in order to have proper and effective scenario-based training. So what we'll do in that scenario-based training is we'll conduct 3 or 4 3.5-minute scenarios where we have people that have a chance to practice what they've been taught in class and what they were demonstrated through the walkthroughs and the techniques. And now, through that reasonable simulation, what we are doing at that point is we're activating the sympathetic nervous system. And that's the sympathetic nervous system is all the physiological responses that are going to be activated in a real crisis. So we want to get used to those physiological responses and become stress inoculated, as the term we use, as we're trying to get the participant through a process of stress inoculation.
Yes, the very first training that I experienced, that I was a part of, that you led, I was participating as a student. It was, you had all of us just simply hide. And you were talking about earlier in our program here today about the futility of curling up in a fetal position, or not. You had us hide, not lock out, not any kind of productive, intelligent, locking out or blocking out the assailant, but simply hide. And then as you went around pounding on doors, it was a terrifying experience. And I remember leaving that thinking, I don't ever want to subject myself to this, which means I need to put myself in a position to take productive action. And so what you were just talking about, stress inoculation. So let's talk about that a little bit. So inoculation, I think the word that comes to mind is we go back to when we're a little kid in the doctor's chair, and we know we're getting ready to get a painful shot in the butt that might protect us from some illness that we don't understand down the road. So tell us about stress inoculation. What does that mean, and how do we productively go through that experience to benefit in the long run?
Well, I'm going to give you a couple examples of it, and then I'm going to give you a study that was done on stress inoculation as well. As far as stress inoculation, it's that really the inoculation, whether we're talking about a vaccine or any type of inoculation, the intention or the purpose is to put you through a difficult experience, and as a result, your body or your responses become much more improved or much more capable. Or your body or your body's ability to combat that sickness, if we're talking about a vaccine, it becomes much stronger. In the case of stress inoculation, what we're trying to do is activate the sympathetic nervous system, where you get used to operating under the influence of those physiological responses, the elevated heart rate, the blood pressure increase, the tunnel vision that you're going to experience. We're trying to get you to experience all those in training, because the more you experience those in training, the more effective you're going to be in real life. And it's no different than animals. I'll give you a study that was done with mice on a stress inoculation. That they took some laboratory mice, and they actually used these mice, and they put a few mice in a bucket of water, and it turns out they're very, very good swimmers. And absent any stress in their life, they averaged where they would swim for about 60 hours before they eventually drowned, which is pretty incredible. I had no clue about that. Then what they did is they took another test group of mice, and before they put them in the bucket of water, they turned them upside down, and they kind of shook them in their hand or the container a little bit to really stress them out. And mice that were very similar to the other mice, when they put them in the water after stressing them out, they drowned after 20 minutes. So they did not perform. If the first time they're in a crisis, a real crisis, they have to perform. You saw these mice did not perform well if they've never been there before. So what they did then is took the third group of test mice, and they turned stressing them out. They would do it where they would stress them out, put them in the water, let them swim for a few minutes, take them out, let them calm down, do it again, and do it several times. And eventually they became very used to being stressed out in crisis and being in that crisis situation. And just after a few times of stressing them out and putting them in the water, they became used to it, and they started to swim for 60 hours, even though that first group of mice, the first time they were stressed out, they only swam for 20 minutes. So we're really trying to do that same thing with people to prepare them for crisis. We've been doing it for years with law enforcement, military, special operations folks, where we conduct a lot of force-on-force training, and we activate the sympathetic nervous system, and we do this, we put them through this process of stress inoculation. So when God forbid they're ever in the real thing, they're going to become much better performers in a real crisis, because we've given them a reasonable simulation and training.
Well, that certainly makes sense. And you even think about it in something that's less threatening, like, say, the realm of athletics. When you step up to the starting line, or you're in a baseball or football game, once you become used to the rigor of the training, of the competition, of the stress, you're able to thrive more regularly. And I know that sometimes people don't want to go through the active shooter training because of the stress that's involved in some of the hands-on activities, but there doesn't appear to be really any other way to prepare for, as you say, God forbid they have to go through the real thing, than to simulate it.
On that as well. Those people that don't want to go through that scenario-based training, without exception, when they get done with that scenario-based training, they're very, very glad they did. And the word that comes up the most frequently is they feel empowered because they were put through that reasonable simulation and they performed very well, and they had a chance to experience it, and it gave them not only confidence, but it empowered them to know that they could do it if, God forbid, make a proper decision, a proper response, it did ever happen in real life.
And again, as you say, even just discussing, some of the realities of it, apart from the hands-on training, not that that's a replacement for it, but again, broadens your horizon and helps us just to be aware of, my instincts aren't necessarily correct. My tendency will be to deny that there's a crisis, and so if I know what I don't know, that helps me to be prepared.
Sure, and what we're trying to avoid is what we call parasympathetic nervous system activation. In the sympathetic nervous system, it enhances all of our physiological reactions, but the parasympathetic, what happens there is, and we see this with people in battle, soldiers in battle, or we see it in people that eventually become victims, and statistics, is we see a parasympathetic nervous system activation. And what happens there is that is when the person has literally given up. They feel completely helpless. Why do they feel helpless? Maybe because they didn't have training. They don't know what to do. They feel completely like a victim. And some of the symptoms of parasympathetic nervous system response is we see a loss of bowel control and a loss of bladder control as a result. So that's really what we're trying to avoid in real life and by activating sympathetic nervous system in training.
Excellent. And I wanted to draw attention to a comment from Jason Hensley. Thank you. And maybe you can tell me which one of these this is related to. Jason says the ability to control adrenaline is key.
Absolutely, yeah. The adrenaline, really, we talk about a lot. Is we can't adrenaline. Another way to put that would be chaos. We want to leverage chaos and adrenaline to our benefit versus we can't avoid it. Adrenaline's going to happen in real life. So let's get used to operating under the influence of adrenaline and under the influence of chaos, and become much more effective performers if, God forbid, we ever find ourselves in that crisis.
That's right. Excellent. We appreciate the comments. And Vaughn, you've given me a great Trivial Pursuit answer about how long mice can swim, by the way, totally unrelated to any of this. And now we know why there were still mice in castles with moats, because they can swim across. I knew it. So, but an excellent analogy related to stress and preparation. So we've talked about our natural response, the untrained response, and then the trained response, and what a difference that makes. So whether someone works for school, they're in a traditional workplace, they're a member of a church, we've talked about the problem. Training is a solution. How can they connect with Strategos to get training? What's the best way?
Well, you can get a hold of us on our website, our 800 number. Our website's strategosintl.com. And if you go there, you can get our phone number. We'd be happy to link up with you. Some of the other benefits of this training we're talking about that we've seen, whether it's with teachers, whether it's in the workplace or faith-based or government or healthcare market, is when people go through a simulated crisis together, there's a real team building that takes place, and people are high-fiving each other. And so we see and not only that, the victim thinks very selfishly, whereas the person that's operating in a team, they start thinking as a team if they're operating based on training. So what we're trying to do is take people from a victim-like, selfish type thinking to a teamwork thinking, working with their coworkers or people that they find themselves with when the crisis occurs. It's the example of that is the humorous example we give is, hey, if I'm with a friend walking on the trail at Yellowstone and the grizzly bear shows up on the trail, I don't have to be faster than the grizzly bear. I just got to be faster than that friend of mine. And so I become very selfish when I start thinking like a victim. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to be acting as a team. So that's some of the other benefits of this scenario-based training we talk about as well, is the team building aspect.
That's excellent. And as we're winding down here, we encourage you to share any questions or comments about anything we've discussed here. And our topic has been our instincts and our nervous system's response in a crisis, and how we can train and develop that response so that it's productive instead of destructive. We certainly welcome comments or questions that you have in that regard. And I'm sure, Vaughn, as you conduct this training, as you see other Strategos instructors conduct this training, you see that teamwork developing just somewhat spontaneously as people work together to block a door or just tell them they can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And believe it or not, it's a very steep learning curve when you activate the sympathetic nervous system. People learn very quickly, and they may make a mistake in training, but we'd much rather have them make a mistake in training than in real life. So they're going to learn from those mistakes. An example would be, we say one of the worst places you can hide in a school is a public restroom. Very little, you can't lock it. Very little places to get out. There's no place to get out once you're in there, and very little to fight back with in there. So in scenarios, sometimes we'll see people run to the bathroom. Why? Because that's what people run to in severe weather if we don't have a basement to go to. So they only have to learn that mistake once, and we'd much rather them learn it in training than in real life.
That's right. I was a couple weeks ago visiting one of our tactical training instructions in Central Missouri, and I noticed there's all kinds of different shooting exercises, balance exercises, all kinds of different scenarios. And, from time to time, someone would make a mistake and the instructor would say, hey, hold on just a second. This is how you want to approach that. And again, that's the kind of place where you want to make those mistakes, where you can have a level of safety.
Yeah, in our tactical courses, we do force-on-force training. That's projectile-based training. And people learn very quickly there as well, because when you make a mistake and you feel pain as a result, you learn very quickly. The Cherokee Indians say only true wisdom comes from pain. So, and there's a lot of truth in that. I don't have to touch a hot iron very many times before I realize not to do that. So we were able to do that in our tactical courses as well. And we see a steep learning curve there as well.
And I would just finally add, if you have not seen the Prevail video that's on the Strategos website, it gives you some great insight. It's just a dramatic enactment. It's not a documentary, but it gives you some great insight into some of the responses people bring, how they can act as part of a team, how they can act solo, positive responses that can happen. So, Vaughn, any other comments today on this topic? We certainly appreciate everybody watching, and we appreciate the comments, questions, and if this is of value, we hope you can share it with others.
No, I just want to thank everybody that joined us, and if they have any questions, they can reach out on Facebook or email us at training@strategosintl.com. And we want to learn from you as well. So share your own experiences that you've had, not only in a real crisis, but also in training and training methodologies that you've utilized yourself. We want to learn from you as well. So thank you so much for that.
Excellent. And I did have just a couple of comments I wanted to highlight as we're closing out. Toby Kittle says a lot of people in churches think this training is not necessary, but church shootings are going up. People think it won't happen here, and that's a very common discussion for us, that unfortunately it can happen here. And Jason, thank you again. He says great takeaways. I'm going to share this with all of our safety team. We are delighted to hear that. David Appel says he was at the TAP for Church Protectors and he loved it.
Yeah, that was the firearms course. So David, I think you came to the Columbia course, if I remember right. So we appreciate you coming there, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Excellent. And we do have, let's see here, one question here, a question from Jason. He says, for large church lockdowns, what would you do with a worship center with a lot of exit points? In other words, a lot of people have to be kept inside, and bad guys got to be kept outside.
Yeah, that sanctuaries, and we get that question a lot as far as sanctuaries. How are we going to lock down a sanctuary? You got two choices. The downside to sanctuaries is typically there's a lot of entrances into a sanctuary. So if our plan is to lock down the sanctuary, we've got to be able to do that quickly, or we're going to be spinning our wheels. So we can do that through technology. We can have technological means, whether we're talking about mag locks, and if we can have a one-touch on our app on our phone that can lock it down, or we can have a plan where our volunteers, whether it be ushers or unarmed security team members, get that sanctuary locked down. The sanctuary is an example of what we call a high-risk, low-mobility area, and there's going to be a lot of people in there, and a good deal of those people don't have good mobility, whether it's because of age or some other physical disabilities. So we need to be prepared to defend the sanctuary as well, not just lock it down. So if your church has protectors on site and are armed protectors, we need to make sure that we satisfy the principle that we believe in. That principle is be where the people are at. Let's not be back in the offering count room protecting assets if we don't have limited human resources. Let's be where the people are at, and that's the sanctuary. Make sure we have protectors that are in there, because it is going to be difficult to evacuate people out of there in a timely manner.
Jason, great question. And then we'll close with one final comment from David Appel. He said, my church had its first all-church active shooter training this past Sunday. Great turnout and great response. People want this kind of training. Don't be afraid to go to it. So thank you, David. And we do encourage people to be a part. And thank you again, Jason. And that's all we have for this edition of Strategos Security Week. Please let us know how we can be of service to you. And thanks for commenting and sharing. Have an excellent week.